I should have known something was wrong when he started working late every Tuesday. Should have paid attention when his cologne changed from the woody scent I'd bought him for Christmas to something sharper, more expensive. But I was busy being the perfect wife, the one who believed in second chances and the power of homemade gestures. Our 10th anniversary fell on a Thursday, and I'd taken the day off work to make something special. Not just any cake. His grandmother's recipe that he'd mentioned exactly once, 3 years ago, when we drove past the old farmhouse where he'd spent summers as a boy. I'd written it down in my phone, stored it like a precious secret for the right moment. The kitchen became my sanctuary that afternoon. Flour dusted the counters like snow, and the whole house smelled like butter and vanilla extract. I creamed the sugar by hand, because his grandmother never owned an electric mixer. Whisked the eggs until my arm ached. Folded in the flour with the same careful reverence she probably had. Each step felt like an act of love, a bridge back to the man I'd married. When the layers came out of the oven, golden and perfect, I nearly cried. The cream cheese frosting went on smooth as silk, and I decorated it with fresh strawberries arranged in a heart shape. Childish, maybe, but I wanted him to see how much I still cared, how much I was willing to fight for us. I set it on our good china, the wedding set we never used, and lit a single candle in the center. He walked through the door at 6:30, loosening his tie with that distracted air he'd perfected over the past few months. I waited in the dining room, hands folded, heart hammering with anticipation. When he saw the table, the good dishes, the candle, the cake I'd spent all day perfecting, his face went blank. "What's all this?" he asked, not moving toward the table. "Our anniversary," I said, my voice smaller than I'd intended. "I made your grandmother's lemon cake, the one you told me about." He stared at it for a long moment, and I watched his expression shift from confusion to something that made my stomach drop. He laughed. Not the warm laugh I'd fallen in love with, but something cold and dismissive that I'd been hearing more and more lately. "Jesus, Sarah. It looks like something from a church bake sale." He loosened his tie completely, shaking his head. "You know I'm trying to cut back on sugar. Dr. Peterson said my cholesterol." "Since when do you care what Dr. Peterson says?" The words came out sharper than I'd planned. "You ate 3 pieces of birthday cake at your office party last month." His jaw tightened. That was different. That was a professional obligation. He glanced at his phone, thumb already scrolling. "Look, I appreciate the effort, but next time maybe just pick something up from that bakery on 5th Street. Their stuff actually looks professional." The word professional hit like a slap. I stood there watching him scroll through his phone, probably texting whoever had been keeping him out so late, and felt something crack inside my chest. The candle flickered between us, casting shadows that made his face look like a stranger's. "I spent all day on this," I whispered. "Yeah, I can tell." He didn't even look up from his phone. "Maybe spending time on your actual job instead of playing housewife would be more productive." "Janet from accounting mentioned you've been leaving early a lot lately." Janet from accounting. The woman who wore perfume that could choke a horse and had been making eyes at my husband since her divorce finalized 6 months ago. The woman whose laugh I'd heard in the background when he'd called to say he'd be late last Tuesday. I watched him pocket his phone and head toward the stairs, dismissing me and my cake and our anniversary like we were nothing more than an inconvenience. The strawberries I'd arranged so carefully looked garish now. Desperate. The frosting that had seemed so smooth now looked amateur, homemade in all the wrong ways. But I didn't throw the cake away. Instead, I sat down at the table alone, cut myself a generous slice, and ate it slowly. It was delicious, moist and tangy, and everything his grandmother would have been proud of. With each bite, I felt something hardening inside me, crystallizing like sugar left too long in the pan. I was done being grateful for crumbs, done believing that love meant swallowing insults with a smile. The cake had broken something in me. Yes, but maybe it was something that needed breaking. The bathroom became my refuge that night. I locked the door, something I hadn't done in years, and turned on the overhead light that usually made me look washed out and tired. Tonight I wanted to see everything clearly. The woman staring back at me looked like someone I used to know. When had I started holding my shoulders like that, curved inward, as if I were trying to take up less space? When had my smile become this careful thing, practiced and polite instead of genuine? I touched my face. tracing the fine lines around my eyes that used to come from laughing, but now seemed to map out years of swallowing words I should have said. I thought about David's laugh tonight, how it had scraped against my skin like broken glass. But the more I replayed it, the more I realized it wasn't the first time. There was the laugh when I'd suggested we take dancing lessons for our anniversary last year. The laugh when I'd bought that dress I thought made me look sophisticated. The laugh when I'd mentioned maybe trying for another baby, back when I still believed we could fix what was broken between us. Each memory felt like stepping on a bruise I'd forgotten was there. How many times had I made excuses for him? Told myself he was just stressed, just tired, just going through a phase? How many times had I twisted myself into smaller and smaller shapes, trying to fit into the space he'd carved out for me? I opened the medicine cabinet and stared at the bottles lined up like little soldiers. My birth control pills, the ones I'd been taking faithfully for 2 years even though we hadn't had sex in 8 months. His migraine medication, though he never seemed to get migraines when he was out late. The expensive eye cream I'd bought after he'd made that comment about me looking tired all the time. Behind the bottles, tucked into the corner where he'd never think to look, was my jewelry box. The small one my mother had given me when I turned 18. I pulled it out and opened it, revealing the diamond earrings my grandmother had left me, the ones I'd been saving for special occasions that never came. Underneath them was something else. My old business cards from before I'd gotten married, back when I was Sarah Chen, marketing director, instead of Sarah Mitchell, wife of David. I held one of the cards up to the light, remembering the woman who'd had them printed. She'd worn red lipstick without asking permission, and spoke up in meetings even when men tried to talk over her. She'd traveled alone and eaten dinner at the bar without feeling self-conscious. She'd never once made a cake from scratch just to watch someone dismiss it. The shower was running in the bedroom. David's nightly routine, 45 minutes of hot water while he sang off key, and probably thought about Janet from accounting. I used to find his shower concerts endearing. Now they just reminded me of how much time he spent getting ready to go nowhere special, how much effort he put into looking good for everyone except me. I sat down on the closed toilet seat and really looked at myself in the full-length mirror across from me. The woman I saw was 32 years old and dressed in a Target nightgown that had lost its shape 3 washes ago. Her hair was pulled back in a ponytail held together with a rubber band because she'd stopped buying proper hair ties. Too frivolous, she told herself. Her nails were short and unpolished because David said painted nails looked unprofessional, though apparently his opinion on professional appearances didn't extend to his own grooming habits. But her eyes still had that spark I remembered, buried under years of careful composure and swallowed pride, but still there, still fighting. I thought about my friend Lisa, who'd gotten divorced 2 years ago and had seemed to glow from the inside out ever since. She'd invited me to her book club 3 times, and 3 times I'd made excuses because David didn't like it when I went out without him. She'd suggested we grab lunch, but I always had to check David's schedule first, make sure he didn't need me for anything. When had I become someone who needed permission to have lunch with a friend? The shower turned off, and I heard David humming something I didn't recognize, a song that was probably on Janet's Spotify playlist. In a few minutes, he'd come out in his good towel, the one I wasn't supposed to use, and get into bed without saying goodnight. He'd check his phone one more time, maybe smile at whatever message was waiting for him, then roll over and fall asleep within minutes, and I'd lie there in the dark, listening to his breathing, wondering how we'd gotten here. But tonight felt different. Tonight, I felt like I was waking up from a dream that had lasted too long. The woman in the mirror wasn't just tired. She was angry. And underneath that anger was something that scared me and thrilled me at the same time. The possibility that this didn't have to be my life. I stood up and smoothed down my nightgown, then looked myself in the eye one more time. Tomorrow, I decided, I was going to start paying attention. Really paying attention. Not to what David said, but to what he did. Not to the man I'd married, but to the man he'd become. I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped back into my bedroom, but something had shifted. The space felt different now, like I was seeing it through new eyes. The bed we shared but didn't really share anymore. The dresser covered with his cologne bottles and my face cream. The wedding photo on the nightstand where we both looked so young and certain. I slipped under the covers and turned toward the wall, away from David's sleeping form. Tomorrow, I would start looking for the truth I'd been too afraid to see. Tonight, I would just lie here and remember who I used to be, before I learned to make myself small enough to fit into someone else's idea of what I should be. I woke up before David for the first time in months. Usually he was gone by the time I dragged myself out of bed. Another late meeting, another early conference call, another perfectly reasonable excuse that I'd stopped questioning. But this morning, I was wide awake at 5:30, my mind sharp in a way it hadn't been in years. He was still sleeping, one arm flung over his face, his phone charging on the nightstand just inches from his fingers. That phone that had become like an extension of his body, that made him smile in ways I couldn't anymore. I watched him sleep and felt nothing. Not love, not hate, just a calm curiosity about who this stranger in my bed really was. I made coffee quietly, the way I'd learned to do everything in this house, carefully, so as not to disturb him. But instead of retreating to the couch with my mug like usual, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. The screen felt foreign under my fingers. I couldn't remember the last time I'd used it for anything other than paying bills or looking up recipes. David's coffee cup was still sitting in the sink from yesterday, lipstick stain on the rim. Not my lipstick. I'd stopped wearing makeup to work months ago because he'd said it made me look like I was trying too hard. This was a deep red, bold and confident. Nothing like the neutral lip balm I'd been limiting myself to. My hands were steadier than I expected as I created a new folder on my desktop. I named it Garden Photos, innocent enough that David wouldn't look twice if he happened to see it. Inside, I started documenting everything I could remember. The late nights that had started 6 months ago. The new cologne. The way he'd stopped complaining about his job around the same time Janet got hired. The credit card charges I'd noticed but never questioned. Dinners at restaurants we'd never been to together. Charges from a hotel downtown on days when he claimed to be working late at the office. I opened our shared banking app, something I'd barely glanced at in the past year because David handled all the finances. "You don't need to worry about money stuff," he'd always said, and I'd been grateful to let him take care of it. Now I scrolled through months of statements with different eyes, and patterns started emerging like a photograph developing in solution. Lunch at Cafe Milano every Tuesday for the past 3 months, the same day he supposedly had standing meetings with the Peterson account. Parking fees downtown on weekends when he claimed to be playing golf with his brother. A charge at Victoria's Secret 2 weeks ago that definitely hadn't resulted in anything for me. I screenshotted everything, my heart hammering but my hands steady. Each piece of evidence felt like a small victory, proof that I wasn't crazy or paranoid or imagining things. The woman I'd seen in the mirror last night was still there, still fighting, and she was done being naive. The shower started upstairs. David's signal that I had about 30 minutes before he came down for breakfast. I'd always use this time to get his coffee ready, to toast his bagel just the way he liked it, to make sure his day started smoothly. This morning I had different priorities. His laptop was sitting on the counter where he'd left it last night. I'd never touched it before. He'd made it clear that it was for work only, that I wouldn't understand the technical stuff anyway. The password screen stared at me, and on impulse, I tried our anniversary. Wrong. Our cat's name? Wrong. His birthday? Wrong. Then I thought about Janet from accounting, with her red lipstick and her loud laugh. Janet, 1984. The screen unlocked. My stomach dropped as his email inbox loaded. The most recent conversation was with someone called JL Accounting, but when I clicked on it, the messages were anything but professional. 3 months of increasingly intimate exchanges, plans for lunch dates that I now realized weren't lunch dates at all, complaints about his uptight wife who doesn't understand him anymore. I read it all, every flirtatious message, every arrangement to meet at that hotel downtown, every cruel comment about how I'd let myself go and become boring. The woman they described wasn't someone I recognized. This sexless, nagging housewife who apparently made his life miserable just by existing. But the worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was how small they'd made me sound, how insignificant. Like I was just an obstacle to their great love story instead of a person whose life was being systematically dismantled. I took photos of everything with my phone, my hands shaking now but still steady enough to capture the evidence. Text messages, emails, Even a photo of them together at some office party I'd supposedly been too tired to attend. Janet looked exactly like I'd imagined. Confident, polished, everything I'd been told I wasn't. The shower turned off upstairs. I closed the laptop carefully, making sure everything was exactly as he'd left it, then deleted the browsing history from my phone's camera roll and uploaded the photos to my secret folder. By the time David came downstairs, freshly showered and humming that same unfamiliar song, I was standing at the stove making his eggs over easy, same as always. "Good morning," he said, kissing my cheek with lips that had probably been on Janet's neck just yesterday. The casual intimacy of it made my skin crawl, but I smiled and asked about his day. "Busy," he said, checking his phone as he sat down. "Might be another late night. The Peterson account is really demanding." I set his plate in front of him and watched him eat my cooking while texting his girlfriend. The eggs were perfect, the way I'd learned to make them after years of practice, because God forbid they be too runny or too firm. Janet probably didn't even cook. Janet probably ordered takeout and made him pay for it and never apologized for not being domestic enough. "I was thinking," I said, surprising myself with how normal my voice sounded. "Maybe we should do something special this weekend, for our anniversary redo." He looked up from his phone, suspicious. "Like what?" "I don't know. Maybe I could make another cake. Do it right this time." He softened slightly, probably thinking about how pathetic I was, how grateful for any scrap of attention. "Sure," he said. "Maybe get a recipe from that bakery I mentioned. Something that actually looks professional." I smiled and nodded, and watched him finish his breakfast, checking his phone between every bite. When he left for work, kissing my cheek again with those lying lips, I stood at the window and watched his car disappear down our street. Then I went back to my laptop and started planning. I wasn't going to confront him with tears and accusations. I wasn't going to give him the chance to lie or gaslight me or make me feel like I was overreacting. I was going to be smart about this, strategic. I was going to give him exactly what he deserved, wrapped up in a bow he'd never see coming. The recipe I had in mind wouldn't be from his grandmother's collection. It would be something entirely new, something that would reveal the truth in a way he couldn't dismiss or laugh away. Something that would show him exactly what happened when you underestimated the woman you'd been betraying for months. I opened a new document and started typing. Not recipes this time, but plans. The woman in the mirror was fully awake now, and she was done being the punchline of her own life. Saturday morning arrived crisp and bright, the kind of October day that made our neighborhood look like a postcard. David was in an unusually good mood, probably because he'd managed to sneak in a text session with Janet while I was in the shower. He'd even offered to help me in the kitchen, something he hadn't done in over a year. "You seem different," he said, watching me measure flour with more precision than I'd ever shown before. "Happier?" I smiled at him, the same practiced smile I'd perfected over months of swallowing hurt. "I've been thinking about what you said, about being more professional, more put together. You were right. The lie came so easily it surprised me. But then again, I'd been lying to myself for so long that lying to him felt like a natural progression." He preened a little, satisfied that his criticism had finally sunk in, that he'd successfully molded me into a more acceptable version of myself. The cake I was making looked identical to the one from our anniversary. Same recipe, same careful decorating, same heart-shaped strawberry arrangement. But hidden in the center, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic wrap to keep it dry, was a manila envelope containing every screenshot, every printed email, every piece of evidence I'd gathered over the past week. "This one looks much better," David said, admiring my handiwork. "More professional." "I've been practicing," I replied, which was true in ways he couldn't imagine. We sat down at the dining room table, the same scene as our anniversary, but everything felt different now. I was different. The woman lighting the candle wasn't the desperate wife begging for attention. She was someone with a plan, someone who'd stopped waiting for permission to feel angry. David made a show of appreciating the presentation this time, probably thinking he was being magnanimous. He took pictures with his phone. For Janet, I realized, to show her how domestic and quaint his boring wife was. The thought should have hurt, but instead it felt like watching a stranger make fun of someone I used to know. "Should we make a wish?" he asked, gesturing to the candle. "You first," I said. He closed his eyes for a moment, and I wondered what he was wishing for. Probably that Janet would leave her husband. Probably that I would continue being oblivious. Probably that he could have his cake and eat it too. His stable, cooking, cleaning wife at home, and his exciting, passionate girlfriend everywhere else. He blew out the candle with flourish, then picked up the knife. "Moment of truth," he said, and I had to bite back a laugh at how accurate that was. I watched him cut into the cake, watched the knife slide through the layers I'd so carefully constructed. The first slice looked perfect. He even commented on how evenly the layers had turned out. It wasn't until he was cutting the second piece that the knife hit something that wasn't cake. "What the hell?" He frowned, poking at the resistance with the tip of the knife. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice perfectly innocent. He dug deeper, and the plastic-wrapped envelope emerged from the cake's center like a tumor being removed. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, annoyance, then recognition as he realized what he was looking at. "Sarah, what is this?" I didn't answer. I just sat back in my chair and watched him unwrap the envelope with shaking hands. I'd organized everything carefully. Emails first, then the text message screenshots, then the hotel receipts, and finally the photo of him and Janet kissing in the parking lot of my favorite coffee shop. The silence stretched between us like a wire about to snap. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, could hear Mrs. Peterson next door calling for her cat, could hear my own heartbeat steady and calm in my ears. But David made no sound at all as he flipped through the evidence of his betrayal. When he finally looked up, his face was white. "Where did you get these? Does it matter?" My voice was steady, calmer than I'd felt in months. He started to speak, then stopped. Started again. "Sarah, I can explain." "Can you?" I leaned forward slightly. "Can you explain why you've been telling Janet that I'm frigid when you haven't touched me in 8 months? Can you explain why you told her I was boring when you're the one who convinced me to stop going out with friends? Can you explain why you made me feel crazy for noticing you were different when you've been different because you've been cheating?" Each question hit him like a physical blow. He tried to rally, to find his footing in familiar territory. "You went through my private emails, my laptop? That's a violation of privacy, Sarah. That's not normal behavior." There it was. The gaslighting I'd been expecting. The attempt to make me the villain in the story of my own betrayal. 6 months ago, it might have worked. I might have apologized for invading his privacy, might have felt guilty for not trusting him, might have somehow made his cheating about my inadequacies as a wife. But I'd spent a week looking at myself clearly in the mirror, and I wasn't that woman anymore. You know what's not normal, David? Telling your girlfriend that your wife is pathetic while she's making you dinner every night. Complaining about having to come home to me while I'm doing your laundry and managing your calendar, and pretending to believe your lies about working late. I stood up, and he flinched like I might hit him. "You want to talk about violations? Let's talk about how you violated our marriage, our trust, our entire life together." He tried a different approach. Remorse, the broken man routine that had worked so well whenever he'd disappointed me before. I never meant for this to happen. It got out of hand. Janet doesn't mean anything to me. Stop. I held up my hand. Don't you dare try to minimize this. I read the emails, David. All of them. I know exactly how much she means to you and exactly how little I do. The cake sat between us, destroyed and revealing its secrets, frosting smeared across the good china. It looked like a crime scene, which I supposed it was. The scene where our marriage finally died. Not with a whimper, but with documented evidence and cold, hard facts. He was crying now, or at least trying to, but I felt nothing watching his tears, except a strange sense of completion. This was what closure looked like. Not forgiveness or understanding, but simply the end of pretending that something broken could be fixed with enough hope and home-baked goods. "Please," he whispered. "We can work through this. I'll end it with Janet. I'll do whatever you want." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the man I'd fallen in love with, but a stranger who'd been masquerading as my husband while systematically destroying my self-worth. The spell was finally broken. "The only thing I want," I said quietly, "is for you to be gone when I get back from my sister's house tonight." I didn't go to my sister's house. I'd lied about that. just like David had been lying about everything else. And somehow that small deception felt like the first honest thing I'd done in months. Instead, I drove to the Target parking lot and sat in my car, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to earth. My phone was buzzing constantly, David calling, texting, probably panicking as he realized I wasn't bluffing. I turned it off and just sat there, watching people go about their Saturday errands, buying groceries and birthday presents and normal things for normal lives that weren't imploding in real time. For 20 minutes, I let myself feel everything I'd been pushing down. The rage at being made a fool of, the grief for the marriage I'd thought we had, the terror of being 32 and starting over with nothing but a shared bank account and half the furniture. I cried until my eyes were swollen and my throat was raw. And then I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief. The weight I'd been carrying. The constant anxiety about not being good enough, not being interesting enough, not being worth staying faithful to, lifted off my shoulders like a physical thing. David's betrayal wasn't about my inadequacies. It was about his. And that distinction changed everything. I drove to the bank first. Our joint account had $47,000 in it, money we'd been saving for a down payment on a bigger house, back when I thought we had a future together. I withdrew half, cash, and opened my own account. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, didn't ask questions when I requested that no statements be mailed to my home address. Next was the storage unit. I'd rented it online while sitting in the Target parking lot, using the same decisive efficiency I'd once applied to work projects. It was small and windowless and smelled like concrete, but it was mine. Over the next 3 hours, I filled it with everything that mattered to me. My grandmother's jewelry, photo albums from before David, my college textbooks, the art supplies I'd bought years ago and never used because David said painting was a waste of money. Each trip to the storage unit felt like archaeology, like digging up pieces of a person I'd buried alive. My running medals from the marathons I'd stopped training for because David said I looked obsessive. The business clothes I'd replaced with wife clothes, cardigans and modest blouses instead of the bold dresses that used to make me feel powerful. My books, the ones David had gradually convinced me were too intellectual, too pretentious, taking up too much space. I saved the wedding photos for last. Not because I wanted them, but because I needed to understand why I'd stayed so long in something that had stopped being love and started being performance. In our engagement photos, I looked radiant, confident, and excited about the future. But as I flipped through the albums, I could track my own disappearance. By our 5th anniversary, I looked smaller somehow, like I was apologizing for taking up space in my own wedding photos. The woman in those later pictures wasn't someone I recognized anymore. She was a ghost of who I used to be, edited down to fit into someone else's idea of what a wife should look like. I left the albums in a box by the dumpster behind the storage facility. Someone else could have those memories. I was done being haunted by them. By the time I got back to the house, it was almost 8 o'clock. David's car was still in the driveway, which didn't surprise me. He'd never believed I had the spine to follow through on anything, especially not something this big. The living room light was on, and I could see him pacing behind the curtains, probably practicing his speech about how sorry he was, how we could fix this, how Janet meant nothing. I sat in my car for a moment, looking at the house we'd bought together 3 years ago, the yellow shutters I'd insisted on, even though David said they were too cheerful. The garden I'd planted and maintained while he complained about the water bill. The porch swing where we used to drink coffee on Sunday mornings, back when we still had things to say to each other. It should have felt devastating, leaving the life I'd built. Instead, it felt like stepping out of clothes that had never fit properly. I opened the front door to find David sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by the remains of the cake and the scattered evidence of his affair. He looked up when he heard me, hope and desperation written across his face in equal measure. "Sarah, thank God. I've been thinking, and you're right. I've been terrible to you. But we can fix this. I called Janet and told her it was over. I'll do therapy, couples counseling, whatever you want." I set my purse down and looked at him. Really looked at him. He was still handsome in that conventional way that had first attracted me, still charming when he wanted something. But I could see through it now, could see the calculation behind his remorse, the way he was already strategizing how to manage this crisis, without actually changing anything fundamental about himself. "I want a divorce," I said simply. The word hung in the air between us like a bell that couldn't be unrung. David's face went through that familiar cycle of emotions: shock, anger, bargaining, denial. But I didn't feel obligated to manage his feelings anymore. That was the most liberating realization of all. "You don't mean that," he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd learned to hate. "You're upset, understandably. But divorce? Sarah, we've been together for 10 years. We have a history. We have a life. We had a life," I corrected. Past tense. "You killed it when you decided I wasn't worth being faithful to." I walked past him to our bedroom, my former bedroom, and pulled out the suitcase I'd hidden in the closet that morning. I'd already packed the essentials: a week's worth of clothes, my laptop, my phone charger, the small things that would help me start over. David followed me, his voice rising with panic. "Where are you going? You can't just leave. What about the mortgage? What about our friends? What about them?" I turned to face him, and something in my expression must have finally convinced him that I was serious. "You should have thought about all of that before you decided to have an affair." He tried one last manipulation, the one that had always worked before. "Fine, leave if you want to. But don't come crawling back when you realize how hard it is out there. You've never lived alone, Sarah. You don't know how to handle money or fix things when they break or deal with the real world. You need me." For a moment, just a moment, I felt the old fear creep in, the voice that had been whispering for months that I was too dependent, too sheltered, too naive to make it on my own. But then I thought about the woman who'd uncovered his affair through careful detective work, who'd managed finances and logistics and emotional labor for years while he played house with his girlfriend. "You're right," I said, zipping up my suitcase. "I don't know how to do a lot of things, but I'm about to learn." I walked past him toward the front door, my spine straighter than it had been in years. He called after me, his voice breaking, but I didn't turn around. I'd heard enough of his words to last a lifetime. Outside, the October air was crisp and full of possibility. I loaded my suitcase into my car and drove away from the house with the yellow shutters, toward a future I couldn't see clearly yet, but knew would be mine alone to build. I'd reserved a room at the Hampton Inn downtown. Nothing fancy, just clean and quiet and completely my own. As I pulled into the parking lot, I realized I was smiling, not the careful, practiced smile I'd worn for so long, but something real and unguarded. I was free, terrified and heartbroken and completely uncertain about what came next, but free. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. 3 months later, I was standing in my new kitchen, not our kitchen, not his kitchen, but mine, measuring ingredients for a chocolate soufflé that I had absolutely no business attempting. The apartment was small, a one-bedroom in the arts district that cost more than I should have been spending, but it had huge windows and exposed brick walls, and a landlord who didn't mind that I'd painted the bedroom a bold turquoise that David would have hated. The soufflé collapsed spectacularly, just like the cooking websites had warned it might. 6 months ago, I would have thrown it away in shame and ordered pizza instead. Now, I just laughed and ate it anyway. It tasted like chocolate and possibility, and the particular sweetness of not having to apologize for failing at something frivolous. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "Book club tonight. We're discussing Wild by Cheryl Strayed. You're coming, right?" I typed back absolutely, without checking with anyone first, without calculating whether I deserved an evening out, without wondering if someone else needed me to be somewhere else. The divorce had been finalized 2 weeks ago. David had fought it at first, then tried to negotiate, then finally accepted it with the kind of wounded dignity that suggested he still believed himself to be the victim in our story. He'd moved in with Janet 6 weeks after I left, which told me everything I needed to know about how long their relationship had really been going on. I'd felt sorry for Janet briefly. Not because she'd stolen my husband. You can't steal something that was already gone. But because she had no idea what she'd won. She'd gotten the David who criticized dinner and complained about money and needed constant validation from someone smaller than himself. The David who would inevitably get bored with her too, once the thrill of the forbidden wore off, and she became just another woman who expected him to be faithful. My lawyer, A sharp-eyed woman named Patricia who wore red lipstick and took no prisoners had gotten me half of everything. The house, the investments, even half of David's 401k. "You earned this," she'd said, when I'd protested that it felt like too much. "You spent 10 years building a life with someone who was building a different life behind your back. That has value." I'd used my share of the house sale to put a down payment on the apartment and buy myself 6 months to figure out what came next. I'd been working as a freelance marketing consultant. Terrifying at first, but it turned out I'd never lost the skills that had made me good at my job before I'd convinced myself that being a wife was a full-time career. My first client had been a small nonprofit that helped women start businesses after divorce. The irony wasn't lost on me. We'd tripled their social media engagement in 2 months, and they'd referred me to 3 other organizations. I was booked solid through the end of the year, making more money than I'd ever made in corporate, and working from my kitchen table in yoga pants. The woman I'd been 6 months ago wouldn't have recognized this life. That woman had been afraid of everything, of spending money without permission, of going to dinner alone, of having opinions that might be inconvenient. She'd been so focused on being the right kind of wife that she'd forgotten how to be any kind of person. I thought about her sometimes, with the kind of gentle pity you'd feel for a stranger trapped in a situation she couldn't see her way out of. I wanted to tell her that the life she was clinging to wasn't worth saving, that the man she was trying so hard to please would never think she was enough, that there was a whole world waiting for her if she could just find the courage to reach for it. The book club met at Lisa's house, in a living room that looked like adults actually lived there instead of like a showroom staged for potential buyers. The women were smart and funny and completely unimpressed when I mentioned my divorce. Half of them had been through their own, and the other half were too busy arguing about whether Cheryl Strayed's mother was a saint or an enabler to care about my personal drama. "You look different," said Margaret, a retired teacher who'd been friends with Lisa for 20 years. Lighter somehow. She was right. I'd gained 15 pounds since leaving David, the weight of eating food I actually enjoyed instead of whatever fit his dietary restrictions, and I'd never felt more comfortable in my own skin. I'd cut my hair short and dyed it darker, started wearing jewelry again, bought clothes that made me feel powerful instead of appropriate. But the biggest change was internal. I'd stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped prefacing my opinions with disclaimers, stopped making myself smaller to accommodate other people's comfort. It had taken 32 years, but I'd finally learned to like the person I was when nobody was watching. After book club, I drove home through the city lights with my windows down, singing along to songs I'd forgotten I loved. My apartment welcomed me back with the scent of vanilla candles and the abstract painting I'd bought at a local gallery, bold splashes of orange and yellow that David would have said didn't match anything. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into my reading chair, a deep blue velvet thing that was completely impractical and absolutely perfect, with a novel I'd been saving for a quiet evening. The silence in my apartment wasn't lonely. It was peaceful, full of possibility instead of tension. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Sarah, it's David. I've been thinking about you lately. Janet and I are having some problems and I realize I made a huge mistake. Could we talk sometime? I miss you." 6 months ago, that message would have sent me into a spiral of hope and self-doubt. Maybe he really was sorry. Maybe he'd learned something. Maybe I'd given up too easily on something that could have been saved. Now, I read it twice, then deleted it without responding. I didn't block his number. That would have given the message more power than it deserved. I just deleted it and went back to my book, where the heroine was learning to trust herself for the first time in her life. The next morning, I woke up in my turquoise bedroom to sunlight streaming through windows I'd never covered with heavy curtains, because there was no one to complain about the light waking them up too early. I made coffee in my small kitchen and ate yogurt with fresh berries while reading the news on my laptop. I had a client call at 10, lunch with a potential new client at noon, and nothing planned for the evening except maybe trying that soufflé recipe again. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that would have felt empty and meaningless when I was married. Now it felt full of small joys and endless possibility. I thought about the cake that had started it all, the one that had finally broken something in me that needed breaking. I'd been so focused on making it perfect, on using love to fix what was already broken beyond repair. Now I understood that the best things I'd ever created, my business, my friendships, My life had come not from trying to please someone else, but from finally pleasing myself. As I got dressed for the day, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and smiled at the woman looking back at me. She was confident and capable and completely her own. She was everything I'd forgotten I could be, everything I'd been before I learned to make myself small enough to fit into someone else's life. She was, finally, enough.